and now turn it over to Foster.
Okay, tonight I am delighted to be talking about a brand new and very important biography. Here it is, Lorraine Hansberry, The Life Behind a Raisin in the Sun. The author is Charles Shields, who's also written biographies of Harper Lee and a man named John Edward Williams, the man who wrote the perfect novel. And I don't know who that is, Charles, but perhaps you'll tell us at some point.
Okay.
But tonight we're here to talk about a writer we all know and whose work, A Raisin in the Sun, is as good an American play, in my opinion, as has ever been written. I just saw the film again last Sunday at the Film Forum in New York, Charles, where they are showing a Sidney Poitier retrospective. And the film holds up beautifully. Everybody in the audience at the end was crying uncontrollably. It is an extraordinary work. It holds up. It's not dated. It is vital. It's important. I think it's every bit as good in its own way as Death of a Salesman or A Streetcar Named Desire. What led you to write a biography of Lorraine Hansberry?
Well, when I choose a subject for a biography, I'm really thinking about two things. The first thing is the subject so interesting that when the going gets tough or slow, will I be able to hang in there for several years? It's not uncommon for a biographer to start on a subject and dislike the person so much or find the topic so uninteresting that they can't stay with them. David McCullough dropped a biography of Picasso after 6 months because he just couldn't stand the man. So there's that initial meet and greet sort of with your subject, and then the honeymoon period when you write the proposal. And then if an editor is interested, I have to think about who's going to read this. Because I don't see myself as a scholar. I'm really a popular biographer, and I want the book to be read. So I tend to choose subjects that most people who are interested in books or plays or films will recognize immediately. And that's how Lorraine came my way. Also, at the time, there hadn't been another biography. Now, there's been a sort of a memoir by a Princeton professor, how the life of Lorraine affected her, and another biography, a short one I haven't read, but I have to say that mine is the most classic kind of biography in the sense that it goes from life to death and puts her in the context of her times, and also the impact that it had on people in the middle of the 20th century.
Yes, it's very thorough. We know a lot about her life and times. When you chose the biography, did you have any pause about being a white man writing about a Black writer?
I didn't, but a number of editors did, and I was sorry to see that, because I would say things like, well, listen, she's a writer, I'm a writer. We were contemporaries at one point, although she's 15, 17 years older than I am. We're both Chicagoans. I know a lot about playwriting and drama. The fact that she's Black, I don't think is the most salient, the most important characteristic, but I will certainly put her at front and center, and not in the rear view mirror of white history. It will be about her and her friends and her family. And yet I only had one editor take me up on the book. And I have to say that it has not been widely reviewed. In fact, this is the least reviewed book I've ever written. It's only been reviewed by the Washington Post. And frankly, I ascribe that to wokeism. I just think that people see my picture on the back of the book and they think, what could he possibly know?
Do you think that if this book had come out before the recent racial reckoning and the summer of 2020, that it would have had a different reception? I think because we're in this moment of heightened racial reckoning and tension, the divisions between white and black are closing, but almost widening.
Yes.
And you might fall into that issue. You might fall into that battle.
Yes, I really, I feel sure I do. I got a little insight from my daughter who is just turned 40. And when I told her that I was writing this book, she said, well, I hope you're going to donate all the money to Black Lives Matter. I said, why is that? She said, well, because you're co-opting the life of Lorraine Hansberry. I really don't know how to respond to that.
Okay, that was your own daughter, so close to home.
Yes.
So, I mean, what you cite as wokeism would certainly have an impact in how the book is being received now. It wouldn't have been received in the same way
Right.
early on. I, as a writer, right at this moment, wouldn't touch it. I couldn't.
Mhm.
I would be terrified of venturing
Yes.
into the territory, to be honest.
Yes. Well, you know,
Yeah.
by writing it, I have to say, by writing it, I was fulfilling kind of a vow to myself. Many years ago, before I'd published anything, I wandered into a library, and on the new releases shelf was a biography of a Black American. And at this point, I can't remember who it was, but I pulled it out and I sat down and I read it for hours. And when I was finished, I said to myself, there needs to be more books like this. If I ever get the opportunity, I'm going to write about not a man in a white wig, a founder, you know, not another Lincoln biography, but someone who should be brought to our attention, someone who deserves to be in the pantheon. And I felt I was doing that with the Hansberry book. I traveled all over the country speaking to different people, going to various libraries, and I think it's just a darn good read.
It is. It's an excellent book. It's an excellent book. But in the culture that we're in now, whether we like it or not, you're being white, writing about a Black writer,
Yes.
will be addressed. It will become part of the conversation about your work.
Yes.
It's just inevitable at this current moment.
Yes, and there's a kind of passive censorship at work as well. I was for 3 months on the schedule for the Chicago Literary Festival, and I received an email about 3 weeks ago saying, we're sorry, but due to scheduling problems, you won't be included. And I can't think of another book that has more to do with Chicago than The Life of Lorraine Hansberry. You know, it's just so apposite. And particularly when there's talk of adequate housing and things like that. But I was dropped from the program, and I've never had that happen before.
And you do see it as a kind of censorship
I
of
do. It's
who you are, of your identity.
right, exactly. It's a matter of just not giving attention, you know, to the book or to me by not reviewing it or not including me in festivals. It's no one is shouting me down, but I find myself marginalized.
You know, when Charles, when I saw the book a few weeks ago, and I went right to it, and I said, and then I looked up about you, and I said, I want to give this writer attention because I think it's a very brave thing that you've done in this current moment, realizing as publishing works that you signed the contract long before 2020.
Yes, 5 years ago, well, almost 6 years ago now. Yeah.
That was a different time. There was this dividing line between now and then is very vast.
Yes,
And everything is being reinterpreted in the light of the current racial reckoning.
exactly.
And in a way, you might fall a victim to it, as you say you have. It happens to be a first-rate book, very sensitive about all racial issues. That being aside, let's go to some interesting backgrounds of Lorraine Hansberry.
Yes.
The real estate background.
Mhm.
Was her family guilty of some? Were they slumlords? They were brought up on charges. They were accused of the kitchenettes. You might explain to our listeners what the kitchenettes are. It's a fascinating part. But Lorraine Hansberry came from a well-to-do Chicago family who were heavily invested in Chicago real estate in heavily Black areas.
Yes.
And they were under some legal sanctions. Am I right?
Yes, exactly. Her mother and father were part of the Great Migration around the time of World War I from the south to the north. And her father had university education under his belt. Her mother was a former school teacher. And he started out working as an accountant and then in a bank, and saw an opportunity with the tremendous number of people who were coming to Chicago from the South. And due to restrictive covenants on properties and just outright racism, Black Chicagoans were relegated to the South Side of Chicago. In fact, their neighborhood was bounded, everyone knew, by certain streets. On the lake on the east, Cottage Grove on the west, that sort of thing. And as the Black Belt, as it was called, began to swell, Carl Hansberry got into the business of rehabbing houses and renting them out. He quickly realized that you could get 6 families into a large old house, but by dividing the floors, you could get 12 families into a large old house. So he divided 20 by 20 rooms into 10 by 10s, put in a freestanding stove, vented to the outside. Everyone shared the bathroom on that floor. And of course, with that many people in a small environment, and due to lax building codes at the time, those quickly became tenements, then became slums. And nevertheless, the Hansberrys continued to collect rent and understand, in their favor that many of the people coming up from the South were not acquainted with city life. They were rural people. And when the city no longer picked up garbage in the area in their neighborhood because taxes didn't pay for it, people just dumped their garbage out in the front yard. And so the neighborhood went down very quickly. The people in that area renamed it Bronzeville as a point of pride. Instead of calling it the Black Belt, they called it Bronzeville. But Bronzeville by the 1930s was notoriously poor and really a victim of racism and also predatory capitalism. And it's not, I make the point that capitalism is a neutral system. It's moral choices that drive it in particular directions. You can't fault Carl Hansberry for his Horatio Alger type success, but I do find fault with them cramming poor families into homes, ignoring building codes, and keeping one step ahead of the law until by near the book's conclusion, the Hansberrys flee to Chicago because there's arrest warrants out for all of them.
But given Lorraine Hansberry's moral stance, her family background must have caused her some embarrassment at a later point in life when she became famous.
Yes, she would get exercised if people wanted to know more about her family's wealth. She was sensitive about being called bourgeois. There was a time in Lorraine's life when she was not a member of the Communist Party, but in letters called herself a communist. And so she was quite aware of the irony of being an activist and someone who was very socially minded, coming from a family of people who were exploiting their neighbors. And I think that the story of Raisin in the Sun is a kind of atoning for what her family did. She's siding with the youngers of the world, the characters in Raisin in the Sun, who are trying to get out of their miserable surroundings and onto a better life.
But I did want to bring up the fact that she did become an activist and very closely connected with the Communist Party and with communists. Was that a direct reaction to her family's vibrant capitalism? The Hansberrys were successful capitalists. Mm-hmm. They played the American game as strivers play that game, yes. And they were successful at it. They made money.
Yes, they did.
They believed in the capital system, and they found a way of succeeding at it. Is that not true?
Yes, when her father ran for Congress, he put on his campaign literature that he was a stalwart capitalist and was in favor of free enterprise. So they were unashamed of the fact that they were go-getters.
And Republicans.
And Republicans, yes, Republicans as well. I could never establish that Lorraine's flirtation was more than that. Lorraine's involvement in communism was a direct reaction to her parents. It was not as if she turned on her heel and walked off in a new direction politically. But by the time she came to the University of Wisconsin, like a lot of thoughtful, sensitive young people, she was primed to think about the ills in the world, and at first became involved in the Wallace campaign when he was running against Harry Truman. And the Wallacites were leftists, and then began to join campus groups, which were sponsored by the Communist Party. And it was a gradual drawing in. And as Richard Wright says, and I quote him in the book, at that time in the early 1950s and in the 1930s and partly during the 40s, there was probably no other political party that made people feel that they had such agency as the Communist Party. They were going to stand up and say no and work for the betterment of humankind. And everyone had authority by virtue of being a right-minded humanitarian. And so this was something that Lorraine hitched her star to because it appealed so deeply to her sense of justice.
Did she, in time, like most others, become disillusioned with the revelations of the atrocities committed under the name of communism in Stalin's Russia?
Yes, that was clear in her letters. First of all, the invasion in Hungary in 1956 by the communists, when the tanks rolled in, was a moment of extreme disenchantment for American communists. And then Khrushchev's famous speech denouncing Stalin and ending with, "Why did we wait so long to admit these things to ourselves?" The stampede for the exits in this country by former communists was nationwide. The Jefferson School that she taught at in Harlem, which was a very socialist-oriented school, closed its doors. And many people disavowed their membership. Yes, by the mid-1950s, she felt that the best way to bring about change was to be an involved citizen and to work from the inside out, as opposed to waiting for the communist cavalry to arrive.
So she disconnected from her communist brethren.
Yes.
She did become disenchanted. Tell us a little bit about her long involvement with the magazine Freedom and her connection with Paul Robeson.
Yes, that was fascinating for me to discover. She came to New York, as young people will do, mainly to get away from her family. And she enrolled at the, what was it, the New School, or it was some extension of the NYU. And that wasn't really her motive in coming to New York. She wanted to find some kind of magic in Harlem that she had read about through the poems of Countee Cullen and Langston Hughes. So she visited Harlem, and at first she realized that she was by no means a Harlemite. She was an upper middle class girl from Chicago. But through her communist connections at that time in 1948-49, she was given an interview at the Office of Freedom, which was Paul Robeson's newspaper, published out of Harlem, somewhere around 125th Street, and got the job, mainly because they were hungry for talented go-getters like herself. There was only a staff of about 3 or 4, but with Robeson's encouragement and funding by people in the Strivers on Strivers Row, Freedom did well for a time. But as I say in the book, the newspaper was a little too international for the tastes of Americans. You know, there weren't local pegs to Freedom. There weren't stories that came from the street. It was about colonialism. It was about the Bandang Conference. It was about a number of things that were outside the ken of most Americans. And so by 1954, 55, it was floundering. And that was about the time that Lorraine got married. And she and her young husband had a different life in mind.
But what doesn't quite come through is, uh, was Lorraine as mesmerized personally by Paul Robeson as everybody else who met him seemed to have been? Apparently, he was a performer, an actor, a human being of extraordinary charisma. To
Yes.
be in his presence, you felt you were in sort of radiance shined on you. You were
Yes.
illuminated by this man's enormous charisma, but you don't present that as Lorraine's point of view about him. Or is there much information about her own personal feelings toward Paul Robeson?
I went through all of Lorraine's papers. I interviewed several of her friends at the time, and Robeson doesn't loom large.
No.
He just doesn't. I don't know why, but she was not, it was the opportunity to be in print. Now there was a moment, and I describe it in the book, when she went in Robeson's stead to a communist-sponsored conference in South America. And it was the highlight of her young life to stand on a podium, read a message from Paul Robeson, and be greeted with cheers of "Viva Robeson" from a crowd of 5,000. It put her at the apex of her young life to be there. But I have to say that Lorraine was not overawed by celebrity, was not overawed by charisma. It was sincerity that moved her. By comparison, she was in awe of W.B. Du Bois, and was so grateful to, in effect, sit at his feet when she took a class from him at the Jefferson School. I have to respect Lorraine's, can we call it, taste when it comes to great men and women.
Yeah, but that's interesting because the Du Bois, she was enamored of him.
Yes.
And Robeson, there was the distance, whereas Robeson's popular presence is as one of the most charismatic figures in the history of American popular culture.
Yes, yes.
But she wasn't taken in by it.
No. As I say, when she arrived for work, as I say in the book, when she arrived for work in the morning, she had to thread her way through the crowd that was standing outside the street side door if Paul was there, because there was always a gaggle of admirers clamoring for autographs or to shake his hand. And
just to get a glimpse of the great man, right?
Yes,
just
yes.
To get a glimpse of the great man.
To see the great man, yes.
Now, you mentioned her husband, Bob Nemiroff,
yes,
who had an enormous influence on her life, on her writing, on every aspect of her life. And it
yes.
was an unconventional marriage, which you're very frank in talking about. You do mention frankly and directly Lorraine's lesbianism or her bisexuality. But you don't say that Nemiroff was also bisexual, or was he? Though there were hints in the book that he was.
I couldn't establish fairly that he was homosexual. I did try to intimate by the fact that his first marriage was annulled and he was indifferent to her dating other people while they were married, that sexuality was not, or maybe heterosexuality was not an issue with Bob. As I say at the end of one chapter, it didn't matter what Lorraine did as long as she came home to him.
But what you do establish is that Lorraine's deepest sexual and emotional connections were with women rather than men.
Yes, she came up with a very interesting sort of ethical solution to the fact that she and Bob were not man and wife in the traditional sense, which is she went to find love elsewhere, but not with another man. And she found that loving women somehow preserved, well, not somehow, but in her mind, preserved her marital vows, and yet brought her the deep emotional satisfaction of being physically and emotionally in love.
Though when she became famous, the publicity of the time mentioned the fact that she was Black, but not the fact that she was gay.
Yes.
And I think you quote her at one point saying to be both Black and gay in 1959 was too much of a muchness. You had to just choose one issue, not two. And
Yes.
she, in a sense, mandated that she be treated for her race and not discussed for her sexuality. Is that accurate?
Yes, very, yeah, well said. In fact, as I say, the founders of one of the first lesbian magazines, the founders of the magazine came to New York hoping to recruit her as a famous person to endorse the magazine. And she told them, she was expecting their visit, quite frankly, I can only be certain things at certain times. And right now, the best I can be is to be a Black female playwright. To be a Black female lesbian playwright is just beyond my power.
And the times were not right for it. It was very much in advance of gay liberation, after all.
Yes, and A Raisin in the Sun, when she said that, was within 4 to 6 months of premiering on Broadway, and it would have been a big distraction.
How much did Bob Nemiroff contribute to the construction, the characterization, indeed the dialogue of A Raisin in the Sun?
Well, someone told me something, but these kinds of rumors flit around in theater all the time. Theater people are nothing if not great gossips. And someone who worked on a play and knew Bob Nemiroff, not A Raisin, but another play, according to him, Bob Nemiroff said, I wrote practically every word of A Raisin in the Sun. But I'm not going to go in that direction. What seems much more logical to me is that Lloyd Richards, the Black director, later head of the drama program at Yale, collaborated with her on this play and walked it through a series of drafts. I just don't believe that Bob Nemiroff had the experience, the vocabulary, the point of view to write that perspective that the characters have. It has to come from inside a Black American. And as Lloyd said, he would mark up her pages, they would meet the following weekend, and she would give him the new dialogue, and they would go forward. And this process went on for months. And collaboration is hardly unknown in the theater. Plays are a collaborative effort between technical people, actors, the sound people. I find that if Lloyd did contribute a lot to A Raisin in the Sun in terms of its structure, that doesn't diminish Lorraine's talent.
No, but the play comes from such a deep place within the Black experience.
Yes.
That it almost couldn't have been co-written by a Jewish white man, no matter how sensitive or sympathetic he was
Right.
to life. The play comes from a deep place within a particular culture.
Yes, the intimacy of the conversations between the family members. No one could overhear that except someone who had been in the room a long time. Listen, Bob Nemiroff's genius was he was a promoter and an impresario. As I bring out in the book, Bob was very successful in the record business. He had an eye for spotting talent and bringing artists along. So he was perfectly paired with someone like Lorraine to get something staged and produced. As they went around finding investors, Lorraine wasn't there. It was Bob and Phil Rose, who eventually produced a number of Broadway plays. But that was Bob's contribution. He was the business and she was the talent.
And that was a great combination. And he made a crucial investment and contribution to one of the great American plays.
Yes.
The play likely could not have been produced on Broadway. Is this accurate? Without the participation of Sidney Poitier, who was on the verge of becoming the first Black movie star, and who also happened to have been a magnificent actor. Seeing his performance as Walter Younger again in the film last Sunday, I realized what an extraordinary presence he was on the screen.
Yes.
I mean, and I do think, I really do think that his performance in Raisin in the Sun is his finest hour. That last speech he makes when he comes out of the bedroom and says, "This is who we are," is overwhelming, as great a speech as any written or played in the American theater. And that's great writing, but it was also a great performance.
Yes.
But you do mention
yes,
that there was some tension between Poitier and Lorraine.
Yes, right. Well, you make 2 points here. The first one is that you're absolutely right. The play probably would not have been produced without the star power of Sidney Poitier being on board. And James Baldwin was of that opinion as well. Timing is everything, we find in history. And the fact that Sidney Poitier was becoming a star, and yet not so big that they couldn't afford him, was just perfect at that time to make this play happen. And your second point was about, geez, slipped my mind.
The tension between him and Lorraine.
Right. Lorraine started, the way Lorraine originally wrote the play, the mother was the central character. She was the protagonist, all right? And when Lloyd Richards began working with Lorraine, he thought that it was Walter Younger's development that was the play, that Mama doesn't change all that much, but Walter has to go from being a guy working the angles and a hustler into being a man and a husband and a leader. And so Lloyd convinced her that they would have to bring Walter forward and bring Mama back into the background. And she was always of the opinion that she hadn't done enough to make one strong central character. But the point that I make in the book is that actually, maybe just by accident, she introduces a primal conflict, which is mother against son. Now we have two strong characters on the stage. And she said, perhaps it's my own inadequacy as a playwright, but I do not have, as she said, one big fat character dominating the stage. I have two. But you know, that adds so much power to that play. But Poitier yet wasn't satisfied. He said the play should be about Walter, and Walter, 80% of the play should be about him. Consequently, he was never quite happy with what he was given to work with. And Lorraine got tired of the criticism and they stopped speaking.
He wasn't happy with the material. It's the best part he ever had. And I think posterity will say so.
Yes,
I think in time to come, when he is an extraordinary presence on screen, but I do think in time to come, when all the work is evaluated, I think what will be determined is that his finest hour is as Walter Younger in Raisin in the Sun.
Yes,
as
right.
Lorraine wrote it, and that writing is gorgeous. He must have known at some level that he was being given a glorious part.
Yes, I hope so.
Now he did demand his salary up front. Is that correct?
Yes. Let's see. As the play was nearing its premiere in New Haven, he was supposed to be on the set of Porgy and Bess in Hollywood, but there was a fire and the set burned down, which gave Lorraine and Bob a grace period to raise still more money. But Poitier was getting anxious about the delay, and roles were coming his way. And so in a rather, I guess, mercantilist moment or, attitude, he said, listen, to do this, I need a big financial commitment because I'm saying no to a lot of good material. And it was more than they could afford up front. So along comes an angel, and a most unlikely angel, a Jewish Polish immigrant who was a real estate mogul in Chicago and later creator of Marina Towers. He was a friend of a journalist on the Chicago Sun-Times who told him that there was an excellent play under development about housing, and the locale was Chicago. And he himself, having lived in tenements and worked odd jobs as a boy coming up, could identify with the script, and so gave them the money that was equal to what Poitier was asking for, and nailed him to the script, so to speak. In other words, he was committed now, and yet he always wanted to be anonymous. And it wasn't until I saw the list of investors that I saw his name. And being a Chicagoan myself, I recognized him.
So you out him for the first time as the
Yes.
one of the crucial producers of Raisin in the Sun.
Yes, and interestingly, his grandson was a producer of A Raisin in the Sun when it was performed with Denzel Washington.
Appropriately so. Appropriately so. Now, when the show came into town, were they perceived as outsiders? Philip Rose was a new producer, was he not?
Yes, he
The
was.
anonymous producer who gave you gave the production the finishing funds remained unknown until you told us about him. So they were not Broadway insiders; they were outliers.
Right, exactly. The people admired them for their chutzpah, that they were frankly amateurs, but so wedded to this play and this idea. But nevertheless, you know, it's a long way between an idea and Broadway. And the Schuberts in particular were skeptical that they could fill a house. And so it was Phil Rose's idea to open in New Haven, and they just crossed their fingers that there would be good reviews. There were excellent reviews. The Schuberts were duly impressed and said, well, we don't have an open house now for you in New York, but if you go to Chicago for 8 weeks to the Blackstone, by then we'll have a stage for you. And once again, rave reviews in Chicago. So their coming to New York was preceded by their reputation.
And when it opens in New York, the first night audience gives it one of those legendary standing ovations. It almost didn't matter what the critics were going to say. The audience got the play.
They did. They did.
Had a tumultuous reception. It's a legendary opening night.
Exactly. They stood, they shouted, they wept in their seats. It's no exaggeration to say that it could not have been a warmer reception than one that was given to them that night. When they went to Sardi's and waited for the reviews, and when the reviews finally arrived, Nemiroff cried because the reviews were mild. But I think it's because the critics in the audience were a little bit taken aback by the power of it. Some waited until the Sunday edition to think about it. They saw it in midweek, and then they waited until the weekend edition to really sort of wax lyrical on what this play meant. But opening night, the reviews were finely executed, marvelous performances, but nothing that would hint that this was going to become an American classic.
But the audience knew. Sometimes audiences get it before the critics do. It's one of those shows, the audience gets it.
Yes, got them right in the heart, right in the heart.
Lorraine should have been at the Film Forum on Sunday when we were all absolutely beside ourselves in responding to her words all these years later. Yes. It holds up so beautifully.
Yes. You
make a point in the book that Lorraine very much disliked abstract expressionists, experimental theater, art for art's sake. She did belong to the school where art is a weapon in the political and social struggle. But the reason I think that Raisin in the Sun holds up so beautifully is, yes, there's a message there, but that's not what gets us. What gets us is the depth and humanity of the characters.
Yes, you're exactly right. Lorraine thought that abstraction in art pulled the wool over too many people's eyes and was exclusive, was exclusionary in that it could not be understood by ordinary people. And so coming out of the communist movement, she was very much a proponent of social realism. So her challenge was to have a message, have a play that was not didactic and had characters that you would recognize immediately, and yet would carry across meaning for the people and meaning that might change them. So how do you keep all three balls in the air? It has to touch them. They have to feel like they know these people, and yet it's not mere entertainment. It's Well, she believed all art is propaganda, and she wanted the play to propagandize the audience.
But she does not hammer us with a message.
Right.
She doesn't indict us. She doesn't make us feel bad. She brings us in to the humanity of these characters. And
Yes.
then from that, we can make some conclusions about the challenges of being Black in America. But
Yes.
she doesn't start with, I'm going to lecture you and you're going to listen to what I have to say or else.
Yes.
Her touch is very light.
Yes, she called that method of hammering it home, putting picket signs on stage. And in her earlier plays, none of which have been produced, One Acts and so on, it's, you know, it seems to be an argument. She's putting forth an argument, and people cross their arms when they're lectured to. They want to be welcomed in, and A Raisin in the Sun accomplishes that.
It accomplishes that for white audiences and of course for Black audiences, but I can speak as a white viewer. I feel brought into that world.
Yes.
I feel included. I don't feel berated or lectured at or told how awful I am. I feel I'm included in this circumstance and that I'm welcome at the table. And I have the feeling when I see the play on stage, when I saw the film, and that's a real art that is lost in a lot of the plays that we're getting now on this very subject, because the subject is so timely and explosive, but the approach lacks Lorraine Hansberry's humanity and universality.
Yes. Now you're saying that's true of what plays, your later plays?
Well, not her later plays, but we're getting a lot of plays this season in New York from Black writers.
Yes.
And they do tend to make many of the same themes of revealing of the problems and challenges of Black life as A Raisin in the Sun. But
Yes.
A Raisin in the Sun is infinitely more powerful and
Yes.
artistic than the shows that wear their messages on their sleeves.
Exactly. Right. When people left the lobby after seeing A Raisin in the Sun, they felt that it was important for good people to do something. They felt that there was an opportunity for them. They felt enlightened. But audiences who feel chastised, audiences who feel blamed, audience who feel that they have somehow contributed to a worsening of the social situation are not going to be motivated. If anything, they're going to be resentful. Positive change comes from inspiration. And the people who were cheering and crying that night at the premiere were inspired for a better world.
And that was what she wanted, and that's what she achieved through her artistry and not through her social activism. It's the artistry that comes first. And it's very powerful. I repeat, I think it's as fine an American play as has ever been written.
Yes.
It's right there with the greatest of them.
Yes.
I would say Raisin in the Sun, of Death of a Salesman, Streetcar Named Desire are the three greatest American plays I know of. I would see them at any revival. I would run to see them and become reacquainted with the characters and the powerful writing. Now, you say in the book that the play is designed as an anti-capitalist statement, and that behind the circumstance is the wish for a kind of insurrection and socialism replacing capitalism.
Yes.
Do you think audiences who get caught up in the feelings of these wonderful characters really come to that thematic conclusion?
No, I don't think that they do. I said that as one of her aims, but I don't think it comes across. What she thought that at the heart of what was afflicting people like the Youngers and the little man from the Improvement Association who tells them they're not welcome in his neighborhood, what's causing this break between human beings is avarice, private property. I got mine, you get yours. And so the solution is to share and share alike, a socialist America. But I don't think that successfully came across in the play, and maybe fortunately it didn't.
I don't think that's what audiences take away from the play. Capitalism is bad, and therefore we have to replace it with socialism. I don't think that's what you leave the play thinking, feeling or wishing.
Right. No, I agree.
I think one somehow feels that these wonderful characters will find a way to survive within the capitalist structure.
Yes.
That's how I react.
Yes.
Rather than, we have to burn down the house and start over. I don't think that's
No.
tone play.
No. And you know what? I think it would have failed at that time in 1959, when people were very sensitive about the us versus them, America versus the Soviet Union. I don't think anything that smacked of anti-capitalism would have gone over well with the tuxedoed audiences sitting there in their seats.
Not. You don't say very much at all about Lorraine's two other plays that were produced on Broadway, The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window and Les Blanc, both of which I saw and actually admired.
Oh, did you?
You could tell, yes, you could tell they were flawed, there were problems, but you could tell you were in the hands of a very talented writer.
Yes, I agree. I watched a production of Les Blanc staged by the National Theatre of Britain. It's available for streaming, and yeah, it's a fine play, but I think both plays err too much on the side of that didacticism that I warned about. There seems to be a bit too much speechifying and a lack of universality, for want of a better word. I didn't go too much into those plays because I promised the reader that this would be the story behind A Raisin in the Sun, and I would need another 50 to 60 pages to do justice to both those plays, only to tell you, reader, at the end, I don't think they're very good plays. So I have to say, I let that pitch go by. I did, for the sake of keeping it a good read and a page turner.
Well, it has a theatrical structure of a kind because it builds up to the opening night and the triumph of.
Thank you. I'm glad you recognize that.
It has a theatrical structure, and your description of opening night and of the audience reaction was very, very moving, and it made me replay my own reaction of just last Sunday. Now, I did say at the beginning that you'd written a book on John Edward Williams, the man who wrote the perfect novel. And I don't know anything about that man. I've never heard that name.
John Edward Williams was a professor of English at the University of Denver who wrote a cult classic called Stoner, which never caught on in this country, but is much admired in Europe. And that little book on John Williams, the man who wrote the perfect novel, has gone into 8 languages in Europe. And I questioned an Italian and somebody in the Netherlands about why Stoner is taken to their hearts. And they said, well, you Americans like happy endings. And Stoner is this story of a professor who doesn't quite succeed in love or in his career. And we Europeans know what it's like not to have things turn out all right in the end. So it's more of it has a European feel to it, Stoner does. And it was called the perfect novel by Morris Dickstein in the New York Times. And I just couldn't resist that as putting it as a title as a way of getting you in.
Well, it does make me curious, having never heard the name of the man.
Yeah.
Now, your other 2 subjects, of course, we know very well, Harper Lee and Kurt Vonnegut.
Yes. Harper Lee was my first trade book. And it was a challenge because she didn't want me to do it. And she warned her friends, don't talk to him. But we Americans leave a pretty wide paper trail through, college, school enrollment and who we lived by. And through real diligence, I guess, and being a reporter type, I was able to find people who remembered Harper Lee growing up in Alabama and what she was like. And her agent left papers, so the whole development of To Kill a Mockingbird was in those papers, and those papers also previewed what only came out 5-6 years ago, which was Go Set a Watchman. I could tell that there was a second novel hidden somewhere in Harper Lee's life, and it did not come forth until maybe 60 years after she'd written it. And of course,
Did you meet her? Did you ever meet her?
no, no, I did not meet her. I was in her hometown a number of times. A man ventured to, he said, "Would you like to go over and meet her? I think she's home." And I said, "I don't want to crowd her. I know for a fact she doesn't want me to write the book. She's very sensitive about her privacy. I don't think meeting her would do anything except anger her." So what I did was I sent unasked all the material about her family and public records that I could find to her and her sister Alice. Civil War records, pension records. I said, "You might like this for your family history." And I think they appreciated that. So while they did not try legally to stop me, they never gave me the privilege of interviewing them.
And they never responded to the book when it came out.
No, silence.
Silence. Silence. Was Kurt Vonnegut a good subject?
Yes, Kurt was a lot of fun. Kurt was a little bit miffed that nobody had written a biography of it. So we had a lot in common. He was in public relations. My dad was in public relations. We were both Midwesterners. His son Mark is my age. And so I went to New York and hit it off with Kurt. Only had a chance to meet him 3 times, because the last time that I met him, I have to say that I was probably the last person ever to speak to Kurt. Last time I was with him, we agreed to meet the following day. He showed me to the door, and before I left, I turned to him and I said, "Kurt, do you believe in God?" And he said, "I don't know, but who couldn't?" I left, and an hour later, while he was walking down the stoop of his brownstone in Turtle Bay, he tripped, pitched forward, hit the sidewalk, and went into a coma. And he died about 6 weeks later. But I found him a companionable person, if acerbic and sarcastic at times. But that was an interesting biography to write, because unlike many writers, Kurt was an extrovert and made a lot of friends. And so many people stepped forward to talk about Kurt.
Did you end up liking Lorraine Hansberry on a personal level?
Yes, very much so. I'm sure you've had this experience in your life, Foster, where someone passes away and yet you somehow feel you're going to see them coming around a corner, that it can't be final, that you feel their presence. And as I read Lorraine's letters and visited her neighborhood, walked up and down her street in Chicago, I started having dreams about her. And I felt that if I just had the right phone number or the right address, I could find her. But I felt very close to Lorraine.
One gets close to her reading your book, and one likes her.
Yes.
She's very available. She may not agree with everything you say. She's argumentative, God knows. She has ideas of her own, but she wouldn't block you out or stifle you because you didn't agree with her. She would welcome dissent, which I think admirable quality.
Yes, we were talking earlier about passive censorship and wokeism. Lorraine was a true intellectual in that she welcomed different points of views, and she considered those different points of views as adding to her education, adding to her outlook, and making her a better debater. She welcomed knowledge.
So she would, if you disagreed with her, she would allow you to speak. She wouldn't silence you.
No, not at all. No.
You might learn something from. Speaking for other voices now, Mark, do we have questions from the House?
I don't have any in the chat, but if there's somebody online now who would like to unmute themselves, we can, let's see, change the, there you go. Anybody has a question, raise your hand or jump on if you can. Okay, I see.
Yeah, I want to, hi, how you doing? Hi, Foster. This is
Hi, Joe. How are you? Hi, Joe. Good to see you.
Put a little light on me. I don't know. It's like it's not as good.
Better.
This is a little bit better. I wanted to ask if, I just wanted to hear a little bit about her relationship with Lloyd Richards, who directed the plays.
Yes.
Can you just go on a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. Well, she and Lloyd didn't know each other. They were introduced through.
I was curious about how they hooked up. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Phil Rose was a record producer who dealt in jazz records originally. He had a label called Glory Records. And he knew of Lloyd and brought him in and explained to him, now listen, she's an unknown playwright. We don't have the money right now, but I want you to meet her. I just want you to have coffee with her. And they hit it off. They admired, Lloyd later said, we admired the same people, Chekhov, Robeson, Sean O'Casey. We talked shop a lot at that first meeting. And I understood that she was coming out of nowhere, but I admired this woman. And I decided to do it because I needed the work. I needed the experience.
Interesting. You know, I will say one other thing, and that is that since this came up in Foster, it was the first thing that you brought up, Foster. I mean, as clearly as you all can see, I'm the Black person here on on the call, and how like this whole entire talk about you know feeling like getting caught up in the onslaught of wokeism. You know, I mean, maybe it's just I don't know. I guess maybe I'm just a little naive. You know, I'm surprised. You know, I really am truly surprised because I just feel like to write a biography, about someone is I don't understand what that has to do with anything with what color you are. You do the research, you do the work, and if you giving an honest take, that's what it is, and so to be honest with you, and to have like editors, you feel like you felt this, you felt this, and I don't deny that you do, that you did, that you felt that. Clearly, it was different than before, right? You read books before and something was in the air. And so I just wanted to say that I'm quite surprised by that, and it's disappointing. I mean, maybe I'm 52. I don't know. Maybe I'm the last generation of the old school. I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah.
Joe, why don't you tell everybody your job? It's very interesting. Tell them
yeah, I work for a Jewish organization. I'm Joe, and I'm the program director for JASA, which is a Jewish organization which we serve seniors, and I run the education program there, which is kind of like a continuing education, college level continuing education program for seniors. And it's a Jewish organization, and it's for all New Yorkers. So just not to give a pitch, but since you put me on the spot, Foster, I will. And, you guys should check us out. And we have a lot of classes. We have theater classes as well. So a lot of our classes, I teach theater. I'm a trained actor as well. So we do that. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it really matters. And so I think the pendulum will switch back, and it has to like find some medium ground at some point, sometime. But I was just curious as to hear. I was quite surprised to hear that at first, So.
But Joe, after all, let's be frank. You are a Black man who's employed by a Jewish organization. You're good at your job. I've worked with Joe. He books events. He knows what he's doing. He's not Jewish, and he works well with Jewish people. And it's inspiring. But that doesn't seem to be where we're going right now.
Yeah.
I don't know. Sorry to say, a lot of race and religion are two separate things. Because I go to temple and I look around and not everyone looks like me.
Right.
But anyway, thank you for this talk tonight. It was very interesting and inspiring. And Charles, I just did a little research on you, and you're very prolific writer, and I'm going to try to read some of your books. And I did read in your biography that your daughter is also an author. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. So she wrote a book called My Year of Religious Modesty, where she dressed like a Muslim woman with a hijab and a long dress, and she wanted to see how people reacted to her when she was covered up. She's a blonde, blue-eyed girl, a young woman, and the book is about difference of perception and expectations just through dress and presentation.
Yeah, interesting. I'm just wondering, as a father, how does it feel to have a daughter in the same profession as you?
I'm flattered. I am. She came about it the roundabout way. At first, she was working for a film production company in New York, and then she went to seminary school and became a minister, and now she's writing, and so I'm flattered. I am, because like my father did for me, I sat down with her and went over her little essays and tried to help her as much as I could.
Yeah, it's great.
Do we have any more questions from anyone on the meeting? All right, I think Foster, we're back to you.
Okay, back to me. My last question. We haven't talked about this at all, but it speaks
Yes.
to our theme of making connections. I was surprised in reading the book that there was a play that had a very strong influence on Raisin in the Sun. And there was even some talk that it was a kind of work of plagiarism. Can you cite the connections between Juno and the Paycock and Raisin, and Lorraine's great veneration for Irish plays and the Irish tradition?
Yes, well, I'm glad you brought that up. During the Irish Renaissance in the 1920s, Irish plays toured America. And Alan Locke, for example, said that perhaps there's something for us here. Here is a colonized group of people who are sticking to their vernacular and writing plays about oppression and poverty, and they're moving. And we can see ourselves on stage in those plays, such as Juno and the Paycock. And that was in the 20s. Well, in the late 40s, Lorraine went to see Juno and the Paycock at the University of Wisconsin and was deeply moved. She said that the wail of the mother, when the mother in Juno and the Paycock discovers that her son has been killed by IRA gunmen, the wail of the mother is the wail that's within all of us. It's that wail of despair, and when will it ever stop? When will it cease? What can we do about the violence? And she walked out of the play that night, as she said, feeling for the first time, she said, that I had the audacious notion that I too might be able to write something like this. And later I talked to friends of hers in theater, like Douglas Turner Ward, founder of the Negro Ensemble Company, who said that O'Casey had that effect on a lot of Black playwrights. Here was authenticity on stage. Here were poor people. Yes, they were white. Yes, they were Irish, but many of the themes were the same. And so she looked to O'Casey as a model. In fact, she had a little bust of him on her writing desk in Croton on Hudson when she lived in a suburban area outside New York. And yes, there's similarities between the two. And she acknowledged that. She said in Mama Younger and in Juno, we see the same kind of formidable female figure, someone who has to have hold of the reins in the family, or the family will dissolve. In any poverty-stricken situation, an adult has to step forward, and quite often it's the female to keep the family together.
So she saw connections between the two cultures.
Maybe very, very much so.
Very much so. And she was, throughout the book, you talk about the depth of her response to O'Casey and to that particular play and Juno.
Yes, yes, exactly. It's true.
Okay, thank you, Charles, for joining us tonight for a very enlightening discussion.
Well, thank you, Foster.
Hold up this book, Lorraine Hansberry, The Life Behind a Raisin in the Sun. I'm sorry it hasn't been getting more attention, but our interviews are recorded. Mark uploads them, and we do get hundreds and sometimes thousands of viewers and listeners. So let's hope everybody who watches will buy a copy of this book, beautifully produced, by the way, by Henry Holt. That's the publisher who took you in, so to speak.
Yes,
They did a very good job. Beautifully written and beautifully published. It was a pleasure to read. I learned a lot. And if Raisin in the Sun is in your local theater, or if you live in New York, be sure to go to the Film Forum to see it during the Sidney Poitier Festival. Good night, Charles. Thanks so much for being with us from beautiful San Diego, where it's 99 degrees, as Charles.
Yes, exactly.
It's
Thank
not
you.
99 degrees in New York. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Foster. Good night, everybody.